Hi everybody, Golden Era Bookworm here, and today I wanted to compare the physiques of Frank Zane and Chris Bumstead. I know there are a couple of videos out there on the subject, but nevertheless I wanted to share my own thoughts on the matter of comparing the modern day classic physique versus the Golden Era physique, and basically look at which is more classic and more aesthetic, especially in regards to the posing ability, and what better way than comparing Frank Zane, who is still regarded as the most aesthetic physique of all time, and at least represented the epitome of Golden Era classic standards and ideals versus that of Chris Bumstead, 2 times reigning classic physique champion of today, representing of course modern day classic physique standards. Now we're going to go through some of the mandatory poses, and starting with the relaxed pose, I will admit it was hard to find a good competition stage photo of both athletes, but nevertheless I have 2 shots of each to compare with, and starting with Chris, of course he's obviously more massive, and yes, this isn't a great shot, and it is a shot from a few years back too, but one can already see that although he has classic proportions, he is opening his legs up like a modern open bodybuilder, which doesn't look aesthetic at all. While Zane holds his upper body similar to Chris, but keeps his legs together and incorporates a slight tilt to his pose, giving his pose a much more aesthetically pleasing and artistic look. I also just want to state something about the posing trunks back then, at least in classic physique, used to look quite awkward, and now they've of course changed it in that they allow one to appreciate more of the upper thigh, which we will see in some later pics. Fast forward to more recent times, and in this shot with Chris is wearing either better trunks or, I don't know, underwear or something, and one can appreciate his upper leg development much better. And by keeping his legs slightly closer together, he's adding that slight angle to the pose. He actually nails this relaxed pose almost as good as Zane's. Having said that, there is this bad habit during competition to flare out the lats in a relaxed pose, which doesn't look aesthetic at all. For that reason, and the fact that modern classic still tends to open their legs too much like open bodybuilders in relaxed poses, I give this pose to Frank Zane. Again, not denying the superior muscular development of Chris, but we are talking about who looks more classic, and Frank definitely does look more classic in these poses. Moving on to the front double bicep pose, and we can see Bumstead even hitting a vacuum. However, this is an early shot of Chris where he again has those legs way too separated, which takes away from the pose in that the pose looks less fluid and more blocky. Since then, of course, he worked on his biceps, and here is a more recent photo, and we can see the improvements made in Chris's physique. I mean, it's night and day, isn't it? In this more recent shot, we can see that Chris's biceps grew much more. I mean, his overall body just looks more massive. And there is no denying that his definition also improved substantially, still hitting that vacuum. His thighs and calves are also more massive, and what's nice to see is that Bumstead's pose looks much more aesthetic than before, in that he learned to keep his legs more close together. So, he gets a real big round of applause from me for that. He looks way more aesthetic nowadays than he did back then. However, comparing with Frank, Frank being a master poser and bodybuilder, he always incorporated this little tilt in his posing, in his physique, in presenting his physique, that just gives him great lines, which would be nice to see in classic physique these days. Of course, they're still learning. Look at Frank Zane's arms. His arms are also held wider and slightly higher. Right, one is actually higher than the other. Again, he's always incorporating a tilt, and this allows him to spread his lats even more so, and giving him an overall better taper and streamlined look. Nevertheless, it is good to see that classic physique and the athletes are taking these critiques seriously and applying it to the sport. And we can see these improvements made, every year. They're being made year by year. As much as I love Frank Zane, I have to say that Chris looks very impressive in this more recent front double biceps pose. Again, the improvement of the posing trunks allows him to showcase the incredible definition of his upper thighs, and to me, he takes this pose against Zane. Now, I really like this comparison of the front lat spread because both photos are of great quality. Starting with Frank Zane, this photo from John Balling, thank you John, has great detail, and we can appreciate the conditioning that Frank would actually bring in competition. Most competition photos, unfortunately, from the 70s are really sketchy. They're not fantastic quality, but this quality photo from John Balling is just brilliant. Frank, although being smaller, was able to look more full in his lats, which is rather amazing when you think about it. His whole upper body is saturated in this pose. Again, it's rather amazing when you think about it, and it again reflects the illusion that these masters were able to create through posing. Frank is smaller, yet his body looks just completely saturated in this pose. Frank and Chris are both hitting vacuums, and although they are both bringing that chest out and up, Frank Zane is able to display his chest better in this pose. Another aspect that is obvious from all these poses is the development of the serratus in Frank versus Chris. Back in the golden era, the pullover, especially the dumbbell pullover, was practiced for both ribcage expansion and for developing the serratus. And it is very obvious that the serratus development is superior in Frank Zane's than when we compare that to Chris's, although Chris has actually improved in that department. Although Chris's legs are more ripped and way more massive than Frank's, his thighs, in my opinion, are just too big, and that goes with all the poses, all the photos in this particular video. I personally think that Chris's thighs are just too big. On top of that, he again separates his legs too much. He does this over and over again. It's a habit that I guess comes from open bodybuilding. Chris overall looks more freakier in this comparison, and definitely more defined, but not as classic as Frank Zane. Zane, keeping his legs together, looks way more classic and statuesque. That is the whole point of having a classic physique, to look like a statue, to look like you're carved out of marble. So I give this comparison to Zane. Zane wins this pose in my opinion, and that again is based on what classic physique should look like. If you are into freakiness and definition, then no doubt that Chris takes this pose. One other little thing is that the way that Zane keeps his legs in this pose allows him to showcase the diamond shape of his calves better. Just have a look at that. And the fact that Chris opens his legs makes his calves look flatter. I hate to say it, but in this pose again, Chris is posing more like an open bodybuilder than true classic style. Moving on to the side triceps pose. Apologies for the quality of these photos, but I do want to compare both the posing here and muscular development. I will have other photos too. I think that again, Zane's posing and ability to hit these mandatories in a classic way was way better than Chris's. Chris looks too straight on here. Too straight on and side on. And although I understand that the standards have changed in modern times to, for example, flexing the legs to showcase the hamstrings, Frank's pose just looks more streamlined and aesthetic. It's the little details, you see. I don't think that holding a vacuum in this pose like Chris helps the pose at all. Instead, Frank flexes his abs. And just notice these little details again. He pushes his hips forward slightly, and you will see this particular habit in Frank's side tricep shots in the following comparisons. And what it does is it gives a nice line to this sidewards facing pose. It doesn't look so straight on. What makes this pose even more aesthetic on Frank is that his triceps development relative to his shoulder development makes his triceps appear more massive than Chris's. Now, this was something that was commonplace during the golden era and is clear from this snapshot from Gold's Gym. And even Arnold is admiring Frank's side trap pose. No, it's not a tumor at all. God damn, look at that tricep. It is just enormous. Frank's triceps are absolutely gargantuan in comparison to his shoulders. And that's the point. When hitting a side triceps pose, show off the tricep. It's a tricep pose. Again, he also tilts his hips forward in both photos. And when we again see the resulting pose from Frank, we can actually appreciate his triceps much more so than Chris's. And yes, this is a terrible quality photo of Frank, but just appreciate his overall shape and aesthetics. No doubt Chris smokes Frank in the definition department in these poses, but Frank, honestly, in this particular photo wasn't in competition condition. I am just trying to highlight that nowadays the shoulder development overpowers the arm development in classic physique athletes, which throws off some of the aesthetics that was more prevalent in the golden era physiques. In this final triceps pose comparison, here we again can appreciate the point I'm trying to make. In this more recent shot of Chris, his physique improved in leaps and bounds, did it not? But again, his bolder shoulders overpower his triceps. Just look at Frank's triceps in this photo by John Ballack. Again, thank you, John. Frank's triceps look massive. This one was hard to call. It was a real hard one to call, but I have to admit, I still gave it to Chris because he looks almost flawless in this more recent photo. Although in my opinion, Frank's tricep development looks overall way better than Chris's. Chris's physique is just so impressive these days. He has improved so much. In this pose, Chris keeps his legs close together. I'm really glad he started learning that. And his chest is more out. He flexes his abs and keeps them really tightened in. And he actually has this slight tilt in his hips, just a little bit. And that was another improvement. And he's also presenting that front thigh beautifully, displaying his calf development too. He looks so statuesque in this pose, and that is what classic physique is all about. My only criticism is that his triceps should be more developed relative to his shoulders, and this pose would be even better for Chris. Here again we have a great comparison of both Frank and Chris, and again several things stand out. Obviously Chris is and looks more massive than Frank. His legs almost overpower this pose, unfortunately. And I have to admit that for me, Chris's pose is less aesthetic than Frank's. It just looks a bit blocky. You will notice that Frank doesn't ever really stand straight on when posing, but slightly tilts away to a side. We can see that his right shoulder, for example, is slightly in front of the left. And for example, he's also pushing his left hip to the side while his right hip is slightly more forward, standing firmly on his left leg whilst almost dragging and extending his right leg. And although Frank is not hitting a vacuum, he still manages to show off his muscular and tiny waist. He almost always, by way of his posing, seems to display full lats, which we can't appreciate with Chris's pose. Frank also looks more conditioned in the upper body in most of these shots, although admittedly, Chris's lower legs are shredded too. Nevertheless, I give this pose again to Frank, who just looks way more classic in this pose. Chris focuses too much on flexing his thighs and keeps them too separated, which always throws off the classic lines one is looking for in classic physique. Now, comparing the back double biceps pose. First, let me just state that Frank Zane's looks very balanced, with even muscular development throughout, whereas the 2019 version of Chris in the middle was nowhere near as developed as the massive 220 version of Chris all the way on the right. Chris developed more muscular development, better depth in his physique, separation, and massiveness, and probably improved on his aesthetics as well. Unfortunately, the image quality of Frank Zane's photo is not as good. I have a better one coming up though. What I love about Frank in this pose is once again he displays the back and arms beautifully, which is what this pose is all about. It's a back double biceps. The legs are kept almost straight, and although he's still flexing them, they're not as conditioned as Chris's. It's obvious, but the fact that he's keeping them together gives the overall pose a better aesthetic look. Chris and most bodybuilders today open their legs up way too much and they bend at the knees, giving the physique an X appearance instead of the V-tapered look, which is much more aesthetically pleasing. No doubt, Chris is completely 3D when it comes to his back development nowadays, and I would say that his back double biceps is much more balanced these days than what it looked like before. However, I just don't like the flow of it as much as the way Zane hits it. Zane's calves are also way more developed than Chris's, and that is something Chris really needs to work on. Chris is hitting this pose like an open bodybuilder again, and I personally don't think it is necessary. Keeping his legs together would make this pose way more aesthetic. Nevertheless, when it comes to muscular development and massiveness, Chris smokes Frank in this department. But let's look at the upper body development in more detail. Fortunately, I was able to find one great image of Frank's back development that details how great his back double biceps pose was. Just look at the details in his traps, even striations for days there, and his overall back development is more detailed, although smaller than Chris's. Not only that, but everything is balanced in Frank's physique. That's what I love about this pose from Frank. No body part overpowers the other in Frank's physique, and if classic physique is about returning to the ideals of the golden era of bodybuilding, then Frank destroys Chris in this department. Chris's shoulders are overdeveloped, more so than his triceps or biceps, and therefore the balance of the pose is thrown off. When taking the balance of the pose into account, Frank wins. Therefore, overall, I would have to say that this pose is a draw. Whilst Chris is more massive and his legs are way better developed, Frank's physique is more balanced. Here again are two quality images to compare with, and a big thanks again to John Ballack for supplying me with these scans of Frank. It was hard to find a good shot of Frank hitting a side chest pose, and in fact, this is the only clear one I have ever seen before. Comparing Frank with Chris, well, it's obvious that Chris takes this pose, there is no doubt about it. Frank always knew that his weak point was his side chest pose, and he has even admitted it to me that he didn't like to hit it, and we can see why. It is not his strong point. Frank also told me that he never really worked on ribcage development, and it shows. It shows. Frank looks flat here and two side on. Chris's side chest pose, on the other hand, is both classic and aesthetic. I mean, look at that chest, it's just bursting through the screen. I mean, it's fantastic with that rib cage to boot. I mean, you know, it's like presenting those slabs of meat. I can't fault it. It's as old school as it gets. Those slabs of pec meat on that wonderful rib cage are just showing his manlyhood. Check it out. Boom! That's a side chest pose, old school style. Wonderful side chest pose from Chris Bumstead. Now to the most muscular pose. Well, here is a good comparison of both Chris and Frank Zane back when Chris actually hit it like Frank did with palms on the hips. And I have to admit, Frank smoked Chris in this particular pose. Zane just looks more complete and better developed than Chris, with crazy striations in Frank's chest, fantastic abdominals and upper thigh development. Chris, of course, quickly learnt that this pose did not suit him and later changed it. He actually changed it to this crab version, and here, well, Chris wins again. This crab pose suits Chris way better in that he completely saturates his physique with thick and ripped muscularity. No doubt Chris takes this pose. Moving on to abs and thighs now. Wow, I mean, this was a hard one to call. This was a really hard one to call. Do I like the way that Chris is hitting it? Yes, absolutely. But his thighs, again, being so overdeveloped, take away from the pose. But that is maybe what the standard is nowadays. I still think that when you look at the overall pose, Chris's legs overpower his upper body. Even though Frank Zane is much smaller, he appears way wider. His arm flexibility and shoulder flexibility allow him to cup his arms right behind his neck, and his elbows are facing straight up, and together this gives his arms a much fuller appearance. They look much thicker and a greater ability as well to flare out his lats because of his flexibility, tapering all the way down to his small trim muscular waist and legs. Definitely a hard one to call. If you like more muscle and more ripped definition, Chris takes the pose. But if you're like me and like aesthetics and the illusion that is created, Frank smokes Chris again on this pose. Finally, we come to the vacuum pose, and you guessed it, but I am sorry if you are a die-hard fan of Chris, but Frank takes this pose. Frank's upper body flexibility again allows him to throw out his lats way out more as his elbows point straight up, and in doing so his arms again look fuller. Because he is able to throw out his scapula, he looks wider and his chest looks fuller too, with striations to boot. Now look at the serratus development on Frank Zane. I mean, it's way more developed than Chris's. And finally, the vacuum itself is superior to that of Chris. There is no doubt that Chris hits the vacuum pose well, but I still think his legs overpower his upper body and takes away from the aesthetics of the pose. The vacuum pose is Frank's pose, and I don't think anyone in the world will ever be able to hit it better than he did. This pose is just timeless, immortal, and iconic. It is why Frank Zane was and still is considered the king of aesthetics. No disrespect, of course, to Chris. So if we were to compare both Frank and Chris, I think overall, based on what is considered classic, they are pretty even, with Frank taking some poses whilst Chris takes the others. No doubt Chris has improved over the years and has still much to improve on. And my main criticism now is that although Chris's physique is more massive, and I can't personally agree with the size of the legs these days, but maybe that has just become the norm these days. But what can be improved on is the way the poses are hit. Improving the flexibility and posing ability of classic physique athletes will definitely help bring back the art in classic physique and hail a new era of classic bodybuilding that has been so sorely missed these last few years. Much is still to be learned from the golden era greats and legends, but it's great to see the improvements made over the years in classic physique. The posing is getting better, and so are the physiques, and it is definitely a more exciting time in the sport of bodybuilding. So I do hope you have enjoyed this comparison video. To me, the ever-improving classic physique is a new sign that things are improving in the sport, and this is something to be celebrated, excited about, and encouraged. So I do hope you agree. If you have enjoyed the video, please give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't, and please leave me your comments. That's it from me. This is the Golden Era Bookworm saying bye for now. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Vince Gironda's approach to bodybuilding, his principles, and all these tips of wisdom that he has, I mean, there's so much stuff that probably hasn't been proven by science, and it will take science to prove or disprove Vince. But to be honest, these 3 books, I believe, which I call the Classic Physique Bundle, are the best books that Vince ever came out with. And they, of course, are the Wild Physique, the Master Series, and the Pro Series. Have a look at it this way. The Wild Physique, I believe, is like the ABCs of Vince Gironda's principles to bodybuilding. He teaches you the exercises and his principles, but how do you put them together? Well, the Master Series is a 14-month program of using all of these principles, all of the diets that Vince came out with, all of the exercises, and believe me, it's a brilliant program. Many people have used it. I know personally a lot of bodybuilders that have actually used it and made fantastic results with it. And of course, the Pro Series was a book that he came out with later on, specially targeted for getting into competition. It's just these 3 books, as I call it, the Classic Physique Bundle, Vince's best work, and available, of course, at www.goldenerabookworm.com. Now, the Pro Series of Bodybuilding, which was targeted for professional bodybuilders, contains 6 programs, each of which go for 2 months each. So it's a whole year, again, in preparation for competition. To support your favorite YouTube channel, please visit teespring.com/stores/Golden Era Bookworm for merchandise, including t-shirts, hoodies, face masks, phone cases, and much more. Once again, at teespring.com/stores/Golden Era Bookworm. Become a patron at www.patreon.com/Golden Era Bookworm for hard to find books, scans of rare photos, and articles on the Golden Era of bodybuilding. To take full advantage of my collaborations, use code GEB20 with NSPnutrition.com and VinceGironda.com, as well as code Bookworm12 at OSL.com for a discount at checkout. And for an entertaining look at the history of bodybuilding's supplement industry, I would highly recommend watching Subs the Movie, which I have collaborated in, available at Amazon Prime and Vimeo.